Hello, thanks for the invitation to speak here. Before we dive into quality measures, a few quick words about myself. I am a physical therapist with 28 years of clinical experience and a strong research interest that started early on in my career. Today, I'm mostly involved in different research initiatives at NetHealth in the US and at Maccabi Healthcare Services in Israel. So these are also my disclaimers. As part of my responsibilities at NetHealth, I've been involved in the developments of patient-reported outcomes and healthcare quality measures that are based on PROs. In fact, one of my first experiences in developing and defending quality measures at the National Quality Forum, or NQF, was, I think, about 8 or 9 years ago, and that was under the leadership and guidance of Dr. Linda Resnick. So this is also a good opportunity to thank you, Linda, for inviting me to speak here. The aims of this short talk are to first understand the concepts of reliability and validity at the level of the entity being assessed. That entity is usually not the patient level. We're typically used to think of reliability and validity at the patient level. Here we're going to discuss the provider level. We'll also get familiarized with some common quality measure terminology used by NQF and CMS. And at the end, if I still have some time, I'll provide an example of how this works in real life. I'm not going to review quality payment programs during this talk. So quality measures, what do they really represent? They try to represent the extent to which high quality healthcare is provided. And that can relate to one or more quality goals of healthcare. And you can see a list here. I'm mainly interested in the last one because my work is focused on patient-centered outcomes or patient-reported outcomes, but all of these are equally important. One thing that's worth noting is an initiative by CMS named the Meaningful Measure Initiative. That was launched about 5 years ago. And they really try to promote measures that have high impact on public health. They also called for patient-centered measures that are meaningful to patients. They try to promote outcome-based measures, so not all measures are process-based. And especially measures that are not topped out, so measures that would have an opportunity for improvement, and also considering the burden for providers, but actually also for patients. And that's especially relevant when we talk about patient-reported outcomes. Okay, let's dive in a little bit to the discussion on reliability. And I'll try to simplify things a little bit, so excuse me for that, but it's really just to make one central point. Reliability has many different names or terms used, some of which are described on the slide here. And again, we typically think of reliability at the patient level. A term commonly used by NQF and CMS is data elements. Data elements reliability refer typically to patient level reliability. The reliability concept is really about the degree to which the measurement is free from measurement error. So we have to acknowledge error, and that's a main point of this discussion. We all know that reliability goes from 0 to 1. It's a range, and a 0 would represent a measurement that is all error. 1 would represent a measure that has no error. Typically, obviously, we're somewhere in between. And reliability could also be defined as the extent to which scores for patients who have not changed are the same for repeated measures under different conditions. As you all know, and we're still at the patient level at this point, those conditions could be measurements over time. They could be measurements by different persons on the same occasion, or by the same person on different occasions, etc. So the different conditions that we could test reliability for. The main concept we need to acknowledge about measures in general and reliability specifically is that a measure is typically not perfect. So what we actually measure is probably not the true score. The true score is really something theoretical. That would be an average of an infinite number of measures, something that we could usually not do, obviously. So the fact that this measure is not perfect really brings us to the point where we acknowledge that our measurement is an observed score. And that observed score is a combination of the true score plus some error. Another analogy that we could use is the signal to noise analogy. Our measure of interest is obviously the signal. We try to identify it. We acknowledge that there's some noise around that signal. The stronger the signal is compared to the noise, the better our reliability would be. If we put this into a formula, this is what we get. Reliability is simply the ratio between that signal to the signal plus some noise. We can already see when we look at this conceptual formula that if the level of the signal is comparable or similar to the level of noise, we're going to get a reliability estimate of 0.5. And that's really not high enough because it really means that half of our measure is actually noise or error. So instead of naming the measure the signal, we could also name it the measure of interest, which is really the same thing. The measure of interest, as I said before, is typically a patient level measure. But we can take it to the provider level. If we do that, our measure of interest might be defined slightly differently. And when we think of provider level reliability, our measure of interest, especially under the thought of a quality measure, is about how well providers can be distinguished from each other despite the presence of error. Again, let's put this into a sort of a formula like we did before. Reliability at the provider level would be, therefore, the provider score variance, the variance between providers, the ability to differentiate between providers in terms of their quality, and the ratio of that to that plus some error. If we illustrate this, what we see here is that if we have many providers, if we can differentiate between the level of their quality, our reliability estimate at the provider level is going to be larger, and that's better. If we change a little bit this formula, trying to define, therefore, what is the error term that we're discussing? The error term would then be the within provider variance. So our measure of interest is the between provider variance. Our error is the within provider variance. If they're similar, again, we're going to fall back into a reliability that's more or less 0.5. I'm not going to discuss too much the methods used to assess these variance terms, but there's a great tutorial that NQF has been recommended for quite a while. It's not new. We name it the LeaRRn tutorial. This is a good source to look at some technicalities on how to calculate those variance terms. And they also provide some examples for different types of outcomes. For example, binary outcomes or continuous outcomes, which I typically deal with. Now, a thing to acknowledge about reliability, and we remember this range of 0 to 1, is the thresholds that are used in the field. The thresholds are typically those that I put here on the slide. There could be others. It's not a strict rule, but these are fairly well accepted within the field. So below 0.7 is really not recommended. We mentioned the 0.5 not being very useful, so we try to be above 0.7. Above 0.7 is typically acceptable for reliability of group level measures. And this is what we're dealing here when we talk about provider level measures. Above 0.9 is what we try to achieve when we're thinking of the patient level. The patient level is different than the group level because this is really where we make decisions for a specific patient. So we want to be even more accurate than when we're assessing a group level measure. Let's provide an example from a specific patient-reported outcome measure. And this is the photo low-back computerized adaptive test originally developed by the late Dr. Hart. If we think of an analogy for a quality measure, let's think of the quality measure as a vehicle, as a car. And the car has an engine. The engine, in this case, would be the patient-reported outcome measure. In this case, the low-back measure. The quality measure is named the PROPM, or the patient-reported outcome performance measure. That is the measure, that is the quality measure on the provider level. And this specific measure was approved by both NQF and CMS for the MIPS program. When we look at the engine, at the PROM, we look at its reliability. Reliability is good, it's good to go. It's 0.9 or above. That depends on the type of reliability that we're looking at. But what happens on a provider level? So again, thinking of many different providers that we have data on, we look at their average quality. In this case, the quality is measured by residuals, residuals being a result of differences on a patient level between what a risk adjustment model predicted to be an outcome at discharge and the observed outcome at discharge. We average those for all cases for a specific provider. We can construct some confidence intervals around that, and then we get some variance. So again, if the variance is large enough, we're going to have a good reliability on the provider level. If we summarize this into a table, the results of the assessment, this is what we get. So what do we see here? We see two levels of providers. One is a clinic level and another is a clinician level. Other levels could be relevant for other measures, for example, hospitals or healthcare systems, etc. If we look at that upper green labeled row, we can see that at the clinic level, clinics with 10 plus patients, and there were over 3,000 such clinics, their average reliability was 0.84, so we're happy with that. We see the range, and we see the percent of clinics that had a reliability above 0.7, which is our goal for a group level or a provider level reliability estimate. And we can see other numbers at the clinician level. If you can notice that the reliability estimates are slightly lower, typically it's because there are just less cases, which increases the error at that level. But still, for 10 plus patients, we're at 0.71, so it's not 0.84, but it's still above the 0.7, with a majority of clinicians having a reliability above 0.7. So this is good to go at that threshold. We need to assess different thresholds because we have to understand how this specific measure for a specific population works. And should we set this or another threshold as a minimum caseload for the measure to be reliable on a provider level. I'm not going to talk too much about validity. Validity is really about the correctness of the measure, as you know, and it measures, does it measure what it intends to measure? And does it reflect the intended quality of care? A good way to think about validity is that it's difficult to prove validity, but we can support it with different types of analysis and the accumulation of evidence. There are different types of ways to assess validity at the patient level. I'm not going to discuss these too much. But when we go into the provider level, it's typically the same thing. We could have a technical expert panel establishing phase validity, responding to a question about validity of the quality measure, and look at other associations that are hypothesized with other measures. So validity is really, think of validity at a patient level, do the same thing on a provider level. We have just a few seconds here, so I'm very briefly going to just show you this benchmarking result for the measure that I described before. And this is the benchmarks that are used in order to set a provider on a specific decile in this case. And according to this, they would get some achievement points and maybe some payment points. Just some keynotes to finalize this. I think the main point that I want to emphasize from this list, and you can read through this list, is the second one. Patient-level reliability does not guarantee provider-level reliability. Both need to be assessed, and the same holds for validity. So I think I'm going to finish up here. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to respond to any questions.